Good afternoon. I call this meeting to order. I want to welcome everyone to meeting number 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format, and so I'm going to have some administrative details that we always begin these meetings, and really they are for those that's online and really our visitors for today. For those that's on Zoom, kindly click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Again, for those that are joining us virtually, at the bottom of your screen, you could select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, please make sure to use your earpiece and select the desired channel. And I will let everyone know when you have 1 minute left. I will sort of yell, "Wow, 1 minute!" No, I'm kidding, but I'll give you sort of like 1 minute left when you have that. And just to everyone, please kindly wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And then just a reminder, because this is, we have interpretation, we're blessed to have them, they work really hard. I'm just going to ask everyone to please not speak over each other. It's going to be very hard for our translators to translate, and it makes their job difficult overall. Of course, please address all your comments to the chair. All compliments throughout the next 2 hours will be very welcome and appreciated. I'm joking, but please address all your comments to the chair. Members, also please raise your hand if you wish to speak. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can, and I thank you all in advance for your cooperation. I also want to say a warm welcome to both Mr. Cram and Mr. Ho. Welcome. I know that you will be you are going to be a contributing and positive addition to our conversation today. Next. Yes, so pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on September 16, 2025, the committee is resuming its study on Canada's immigration system. I now would like to warmly welcome our witnesses for today by video conference. And as an individual, we have Audrey Macklin, Professor and Chair in Human Rights Law, Faculty of Law, University of Toronto. Welcome. And just to let you know, you've got your boom thing up, and just so you know, often I start talking and then I forget, so then I'm like, we can't hear you, and then that's basically it, but thank you. And then here in person, we have two representatives from the Refugee Centre, Eva Garcia-Turgeon, Director of Quebec Government Relations, and Alina Murad, Director of Federal Government Relations. So each one of you, well, both groups, so just we'll have 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. So now I'm actually going to start online, if that's okay, with Professor Macklin. If we could begin with you, and you can begin for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I thank you for this opportunity to address the committee. My remarks will focus on the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement, the STCA. As you know, the legal prerequisite for the STCA is that both the U.S. and Canada are safe countries to seek and obtain refugee protection. If the United States is not safe, Canada violates the Charter and international law by returning refugee claimants to the United States. Under the STCA and legislation implementing it, the U.S. will be unsafe if it sends refugees back to countries where they will not be protected from persecution or from onward deportation to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution. This is known as refoulement. The United States will also be unsafe if it subjects refugee claimants to arbitrary human rights violations on U.S. territory, including arbitrary detention and other forms of abuse. In mid-2023, the Supreme Court of Canada found that the United States at that time was a safe country. It did so by overturning findings of fact made by the trial judge at the first hearing of the STCA case. And in particular, findings that refugee claimants were subject to arbitrary detention and abusive circumstances. The Supreme Court found that detention was not routine for asylum seekers, and that detention conditions that amounted to abuse could not have been reasonably foreseen by Canadian officials. That judgment about the United States is only as durable as the underlying facts upon which it's based. So if the facts about the United States have changed, the conclusions of the Supreme Court of Canada will no longer be valid in the present. So what's been happening in the United States since January of 2025? Well, let me give you some examples. First, the United States has barred all asylum claims made at the Mexico-U.S. border. To bar asylum claims directly violates the United States' obligations under the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, which obliges states to extend protection to those who meet the definition of a refugee who are at or within their borders. Another example, the United States has entered into several agreements with other states where it will send asylum seekers. These countries are not necessarily countries that asylum seekers have passed through en route to the United States. They are random third countries. Many of these countries have abysmal human rights records and are not safe. They include Sudan, Eswatini, Honduras, Rwanda, among other countries. People who are deported there face imprisonment and human rights abuses and possibly removal to face persecution in their countries of origin. Third, the U.S. government now uses those third country agreements as the basis for terminating asylum claims already made in the United States. And they do so through a process that is known as pretermission. This is one of several strategies that the United States government has deployed to deny asylum seekers access to a fair process in the United States and to deport them to countries where they may first face persecution on site or be refouled, returned to their country of origin to face a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, turning to conditions of human rights within the United States for asylum seekers, I'll just give you the example of detention. So if you recall, the Supreme Court of Canada found that detention was not, in fact, automatic and not abusive. Today, 1 year after President Trump has entered his second term, the use of detention is now mandatory and automatic for people in what is called expedited removal, and that's many people who are asylum seekers. So far, over 70,000 people are detained in the United States, which is a 75% increase over 1 year. And over 90% of this growth in detention are of people, including children, with no criminal convictions.
1 minute.
Detention conditions are widely reported to violate fundamental human rights, physical, sexual, psychological, child abuse, with inadequate food, medical neglect, poor sanitation, etc. 38 people have died in U.S. immigration detention in the last year. All evidence points incontrovertibly to the conclusion that the United States is not presently a safe country to seek or obtain refugee protection. Meanwhile, the current Canadian government has redoubled its efforts to enforce the STCA, and it refuses to publicly explain in public why it continues to enforce the agreement. In the face of overwhelming evidence that the United States is not safe, efforts to seek accountability through the courts are stonewalled. So my request to you is I call on you as a committee to require the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship and the Deputy Minister to justify with evidence the continued designation of the United States as a safe country to seek and obtain refugee protection. In the absence of this justification, Canada must withdraw from the STCA immediately and divert resources to safe, regular and orderly processing of refugee claimants at Canadian ports of entry along the Canada-US border. Thank you very much.
So much, Professor Macklin. And next, for 5 minutes, who will be speaking? Both? Okay, so we will have from the Refugee Center. Yes, from the Refugee Center, please.
Madam Speaker and honorable members, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Alina Murad. I am the Director of Federal Government Relations, and I will be speaking in English.
Hi, my name is Eva Gracia-Turgeon. I'm the Director of Quebec Government Relations, and I'll be speaking in French. Nous sommes ici au nom du Centre de réfugiés.
We are here from the Refugee Center, which is a community organization that works directly with refugee claimants every day and witnesses both the potential they represent and the systemic barriers that prevent them from rebuilding their lives in safety.
Our message today is simple. Canada's asylum system can be both efficient and humane if we begin to see refugee claimants as a benefit rather than a burden through feasible policy changes. The Refugee Center has seen how bureaucratic inefficiencies directly impact the lives of future citizens. Delayed documentation, inaccessible legal aid, and limited economic pathways compound to hinder the otherwise successful settlement of refugee claimants. The first priority is modernizing documentation issuance. Today, refugee claimants rely on paper documents that are frequently delayed, lost, or misunderstood by service providers. We propose adopting a secure ID card with a QR code on the back, allowing work permits, eligibility status, and health assessments to be uploaded automatically based on a model being used in Sweden. This would significantly reduce processing and mailing delays, restore dignity to claimants accessing services, and accelerate entry into the labor market. At present, some claimants wait up to 2 years for an initial work permit, not because they are ineligible, but because of administrative bottlenecks. That delay directly increases pressure on provincial social assistance systems and shelters while depriving the economy of workers who are ready and willing to contribute. Evidence shows that refugee claimants are already reporting earnings higher than other refugee categories, and in some provinces approach those of economic migrants. Faster documentation means faster integration and stronger economic outcomes.
Deuxièmement, nous devons aussi
Second, we must standardize legal aid access for refugee claimants across Canada. Access to justice should not depend on the province of arrival, yet legal aid coverage, compensation models, and availability of mandated lawyers vary widely. In Quebec, the fragmented fee structures are not realistic, and they deter lawyers from taking legal aid files. In Ontario, hourly compensation has proven more effective. The result is predictable. Claimants are overcharged, misadvised, or exploited by bad actors, and governments pay later through increased appeals, judicial reviews, and abandoned claims. Therefore, a federal-provincial cost-shared envelope paired with standardized compensation models would improve representation, reduce downstream system costs, and support IRCC priorities such as Francophone and rural mobility.
Third, it is essential to safeguard procedural fairness mechanisms. The data is clear. In the first 9 months of 2025, the acceptance rate for refugee claims reached 78%, of which less than 1% were fraudulent claims. And only 30% of appeals filed in 2024 were allowed. This tells us that initial decision-making is generally sound. The Immigration and Refugee Board's independence and procedural fairness safeguards are not obstacles. They are what protect charter compliance, public trust, and system integrity. Weakening them would increase appeals, judicial reviews, and not reduce them.
Quatrièmement, le Canada doit contribuer à développer.
Fourth, Canada must continue to expand complementary pathways that allow people to arrive safely without risking their lives. Programs like the Economic Mobility Pathways pilot demonstrate that protection and economic contribution are not competing objectives. Complementary pathways reduce pressure on the asylum system, address labor shortages, and allow newcomers to integrate more quickly. Expanding these pathways across economic, labor, and education streams is a pragmatic response to both humanitarian and workflow realities.
In closing, Canada's asylum system does not fail because refugee claimants lack potential. It falters when bureaucracy delays work and legal stability for people who are neighbors, workers, and taxpayers. Madam Chair, the recommendations before you are practical, targeted, and backed by years of frontline experience. They would reduce administrative pressure and uphold Canada's legal obligations and unlock the immense potential of refugee claimants in this country. Canada has the capacity and the responsibility to build an asylum system that is fair, functional, and recognizes the talents and contributions of refugee claimants. By exploring these recommendations, not only will our defining values as a country be upheld, but our crucial and foundational institutions will be strengthened. Merci.
Merci.
Great job. Thank you. Okay, so thanks to both of our speakers for their 5 minutes. And now I am going to move to the first round of questions. We will start off with Mr. Davies for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
My first time at the first round.
Yes, I'm very excited too.
Thank you to the presenters and for the information that you've given us. I wanted to sort of dig in a bit, if you don't mind, on the refugee side of things. Are you tracking, or do you have any intelligence? Do you monitor or dive into the data on the number of refugees that seem to have sort of disappeared into the fabric of the country right now, that we don't really know where they are?
I'm so sorry. If I could ask for a little bit more clarification on that.
Well, I'll give you an example. In the city of Niagara Falls, we had, over a period of 18 months, we had the majority of the hotel rooms that were given to refugee claimants. They have since ceased being given funds for housing in those hotel rooms. But I want to know, where did they go?
C'est une très bonne question. En fait,
A very good question. We would love to be able to do the necessary follow-ups to know where people go. It's one of our objectives, but unfortunately we don't have the funding to be able to do this. But it's clear that what we consider is that in asylum claims, about 50% will go back to their networks, to their families, to the people that have met along the way, and the other 50% will need to go through housing, either provided by the government at the provincial level, etc. But our organization, we do offer housing, so we have a transitional housing program, and this is expertise that we have developed within our organization. And one of the points in our brief is that unfortunately funding doesn't receive sufficient funding, and the community at large ends up picking the tab, as it were. The cost, rather, is 3 times higher than the federally funded hotels that you referenced in Niagara.
So let me dig into the transitional funding side of things. Where does that funding come from? You said cities or provinces?
donc, le PALP en français ou le IAP.
So the IAP is the federal program that funds these sorts of services, so transitional housing services. But as we speak, this funding is only provided to provinces or municipalities directly, which pays for the hotel rooms, for instance.
Funds at all allocated to housing for refugees that have been previously housed in hotel rooms?
Qui ont été I'll answer back in English, it's going to be easier. So that have been previously housed in hotels in the sense afterwards?
No. Well, over the last 18 months, there have been thousands and thousands of refugees that have been housed in hotel rooms and paid a daily rate. But what I've found in my investigation is that many of these refugees that have ceased to have per diem funding for housing have actually moved into other hotels that have actually transitioned from the classification of hotel room to apartments. And I'm just trying to find out who pays for that and where the money comes from.
Okay. So there's different systems. We have certain funds that are private. If some organizations are able to provide that service, it's the case at the Refugee Center because there is no provincial or federal funding for that. We find funds elsewhere to be able to provide for that. And the transitional housing that is offered is always in a trajectory that allows people to then after go to an apartment.
And who pays for the apartment?
The claimant themselves.
And are they allowed to work during this period?
Yes.
So all of the refugee claimants are assigned a social insurance number?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know of any statistics of refugee claimants that have actually sort of disappeared into the economy that are working and not actually proceeding through the refugee claimant process?
You would mean that they abandoned their claim?
Yeah, so many that may have abandoned their claim and are just working using a social insurance number that was allocated by the federal government.
No, that's not something that we have seen on the ground at the Refugee Center.
Okay.
Largely for the rest of Canada, regarding reports that we have read and been a part of, that is not something that we have seen occurring.
1 minute.
You had mentioned that there was a bureaucratic backlog. In your estimation, how long is it going to take to clear that backlog? And that's a sort of a pre-question to things that may happen again as we may see an influx of Haitian refugees. Are you anticipating a problem with that?
The backlog problem is always going to be a problem until the backlog is dealt with. I unfortunately cannot answer how long that would take. I think IRCC would be better suited to answer that question. I would not say that the influx of Haitian migrants specifically would pose a concern to the backlog. The reality is that as long as socio-political conditions in countries of origin continue to worsen and go down the path that they are going down, people will continue to seek refuge.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Thank you, Ms. Murad. Before we go to our first 6-minute round on the Liberal side, I would like to warmly welcome the participants of the Parliamentary Officers Study Program who are here to observe our meeting. So thank you and a warm welcome. Mr. Zuberi, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to all the witnesses for being here in person and by Zoom. I wanted to start off with Professor Macklin, and you were speaking to a fair degree about the Safe Third Country Agreement, what's happening in the United States right now. We've all been watching the news, seeing how people of color, to be frank, are being rounded up and asked about what their immigration status is, whether or not they're citizens. And we've all seen what's happened in Minneapolis, the tragedies there. And you mentioned that the dynamics have changed, and I think it's obvious to any objective and fair-minded person that dynamics have changed. I was curious if you can dive a bit more into what's happened with respect to Canadians. Have any Canadians been impacted by what's happening in the last weeks and months in the United States?
Thank you for your question. I'm not sure that I can give you a detailed response, except to say that we all know that there are Canadian citizens who have been swept up in the dragnet of this U.S. kind of campaign to deport non-citizens. And I probably know the same as you based on what is reported in the media and anecdote about Canadians taken into detention, disappeared for periods of time, things that didn't happen in the past. And I want to say that this underscores that we have entered a fundamentally different phase of conduct in the United States. It is certainly racialized. No doubt about that. The fact that Canadians have been swept up in it, including Canadians who are racialized as white, tells us something about how expansive this campaign is.
And to your knowledge, have any American citizens been mistakenly arrested by ICE?
Many times. So there is, in fact, a separate detention unit in many of these detention centers that you will have heard about, where they detain U.S. citizens. So they actually know that they're detaining U.S. citizens, and they put them in a separate part of the facility pending their ultimate release. So it's no secret that U.S. citizens have also been apprehended, kidnapped, if you will, and arbitrarily and unlawfully detained.
Just to pause a moment before I continue, I'd like to open up the same questions that I asked to Ms. Murad et Madame Gracia Turgan. Si vous avez des commentaires par rapport à mes deux questions, s'il vous plaît, juste ajouter.
So, if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
I think that Ms. Macklin summarized it very, very well. This is definitely an issue that Canadians are impacted by, as she highlighted. I would also like to say that when it comes to the agreement and returning people to the U.S., that is definitely a situation that we should be considering if returning people to the U.S. during these conditions is the safest option.
Thank you. So what you're describing right now, has this been a dynamic change from when the Supreme Court looked at the case in 2023?
Absolutely. Sorry, did you direct that at me? Yeah.
Feel free, please, to elaborate further.
Okay, I'll jump in. So the trial judge in the Supreme Court of Canada case found that one of the litigants in particular had been subject to arbitrary detention and was at risk of removal to her country of origin, and she was detained in the United States in frigid conditions. And this is actually, there's a term for this in the United States, of putting detainees in detention and then turning down the temperature so that it's called the fridge, actually, in Spanish. The Supreme Court of Canada said that this was probably not typical, and it didn't happen all the time, and there was no reason to think that asylum seekers were routinely detained. On that basis, then, they concluded that the United States as a whole was not an unsafe place to seek or obtain refugee protection, and further, that there was no reason why Canada ought to have known of perhaps exceptional circumstances or cases or anomalous events like this. So that was what Canada said about the United States in 2023. But that finding, of course, is only as stable as the facts upon which that finding is based. I hope that I don't have to persuade any of you who have been paying attention to what's happening in the United States that those things no longer apply. And I want to also emphasize that it's not just random events. In fact, one of the executive orders by President Trump imposes mandatory indefinite detention on people who are subject to what they call expedited removal. And within that category are people who are seeking asylum. So that's a dramatic change, right? It is automatic detention in abusive conditions for asylum seekers under expedited removal.
Certainly.
That's a significant change.
And in your initial 5 minutes, you mentioned, Professor Macklin, that currently, the United States is deporting people to countries like Sudan and other states. Was that the case in 2023 when the Supreme Court opined, as you explained to us, where those third states were places where people in the United States were being deported to?
Short answer is no. The longer answer is that under the first Trump administration, President Trump entered into agreements with 3 countries, I think it was Honduras, maybe El Salvador and Guatemala, 3 countries in Central America, to do something like this, third country removals of asylum seekers. But those agreements were swiftly undone when President Biden came into office and were no longer in force in 2023 when the Supreme Court of Canada made its decision.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zuberi. Thank you, Professor Macklin. Maintenant, c'est à vous, Monsieur.
Now, it's up to you, Mr. Bernal de Sept, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thanks to our witnesses for being here with us today. Well, at numerous occasions, I have helped people that were about to be expulsed and literally pulled them out of airplanes a couple times. People who have been here for a long time, their asylum claim took, in some cases, 3, 4, 5 years, because we often talk about challenges with housing, legal aid, funding, hardship for organizations like yours. Rather than trying to put out fires all the time, should we not really look into the time frames, processing timelines for these claims, and establish levels that are more acceptable? Would that not be solving more problems? Yes, that's a great point. So the processing times are a key issue in the asylum process. Sometimes the many components of the process are delayed, such as the hearing or last-minute changes, and all of the communication is done via email. So there's a component of literacy for people who maybe do not have access to the technological means, but we're also talking about having access to justice. There's the question of processing timelines, but good representation should also be part of the picture. Some people come to the point of being expulsed because there's fraud involved in some cases, and sometimes they lack legal aid, and they don't have competent representation in some situations. So they, for instance, end up doing copy and paste claims. So the individuals implicated find themselves in a tough spot because they haven't been well represented or defended. And this represents a lot of cost as well because there are appeals, etc. So yes, 2 components go hand in hand, I would say. So the immigration consultants issue They are not regulated in any way, shape, or form. It's the Wild West. And they are dealing with completely vulnerable individuals. And even though we try to help people out, if they're being fed the wrong information by the consultants, then it doesn't really help our situation. So the processing timelines is something that I'm really interested in. It could be really a game changer, as my friends would say, on this side of the river. So, I mean, if you file an asylum claim, if you filed it 2 years ago, let's say, and then it's dealt with in 4 years' time, then maybe the issue that led you to flee your country no longer exists, or the opposite might be correct. The context in your country maybe has changed and you can no longer go back, even if you wanted to. So the federal government should probably put more funding into this to reduce the backlog in terms of the processing timelines. Yes, this is a call that's been coming from our industry for a while now, and our colleague Audrey could probably say more on that, but the timelines are long and situations can change, and this represents additional workload for people dealing with that file because they have new facts that they need to take into account. We have highlighted also the issue of the timelines with regard to work permits. In Quebec, for instance, we had about 2 months, which was quite reasonable, before people got a work permit. But it also depends on the situations of the individual. So people want to work. They don't want to be out there begging. What they want is that their files are processed quickly. So having to wait that deadline or that time frame is the worst that can happen to a person. So the federal government, provinces, and Quebec would share the costs of the system that you have proposed. With regard to legal aid, yes, that's what we proposed. International conventions are signed by the federal government only, so refugees or asylum claimants, they are bound by federal jurisdiction only, so I have a hard time understanding how the provinces who are not the signatories to these conventions would have to pay because the federal government is the only responsible party. Maybe this is just to modify what you have been suggesting. I also would like to hear what you think about partitioning the asylum seekers across Canada, because the vast majority of them are in Ontario and in Quebec. So the provincial-federal split is already what's happening on the ground. Last year, for instance, with regard to legal aid, there was a gap of $10 million across Canada for the real costs of the services provided. So provinces need to step up in those cases, and they pay part of it. So there is a real need. And having better representation at the outset will help avoid problems later on. But this, we are referring to an agreement that might be maybe a bit more clear so that there is a better service that is provided at the outset. Unfortunately, it is not the case as we speak. Thank you. Thank you. That's all the time we had. Thank you, Ms. Garcia Turgeon and Mr. Bernal-Duceppe.
We're going to start with Mr. Ho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for the team at the Refugee Center from Montreal. If I'm not mistaken, your agency is funded by federal dollars. Is that correct?
No, we actually diversify our funding. So we do have private funding as well as grants from, again, private foundations.
You have some government funding as well, or is just most or all private funding?
We have some federal funding, but it's absolutely not the majority.
Okay, got it. And you folks have been around since 2015, is that correct, the agency? Have you seen an influx in refugees that you're serving in that time frame? Has there been a spike at any of those years?
I've been at the center for 4.5 years, and I would say that the influx that we see is fairly steady. The only thing that I personally have noticed is that when policies change in either the U.S. or in other countries of origin, or if political situations change in countries of origin, then we do tend to see the demographic shift with that.
Wow. And I don't know if you track this in your agency, but do you track employment outcomes in your agency? And so what are the success rates in terms of 6 months, 12 months, or whatever metric you use to track employment outcomes?
Yes, so the tracking is relatively new. We do have a sector within our center that does pair refugee claimants with employment. Of course, the main goal is to make sure that people are autonomous and self-sustaining. I would say typically we are able to match refugees and empower them to get employment within, I would say, about between 6 to 12 months. It's a large range, but as I said, the tracking is fairly new.
So what percentage would not be able to find employment within those 6 to 12 months after going?
It's a very, very small percentage. I would say under 10%.
Okay. And how about official language proficiency? What are you seeing in terms of those rates coming out of your center?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on the demographic. Of course, Haitians come knowing French. Potentially there's some literacy issues on that end, but that's very easily solvable. When it comes to being based in Quebec, French is, of course, the language that refugee claimants need to learn. There's provincial classes for French. However, the wait times are quite long. They go past 6 months. At the center, we do provide both English and French classes. So I would say that the majority, if not all, of our clients do speak both languages.
So you mentioned something about the bureaucratic mess that you see from Ottawa. So do you get any kind of targets or coordination from Ottawa in terms of resources or a heads up of the influx that you see, or is it you're sort of going in blind most of the time?
Oh, sorry. Yes, sort of going in blind at the time. Through different networking opportunities, we can potentially ask questions, but yes, going in blind.
Normal channel, you gotta have a cocktail in order to get that information out of them, right? Yes. Yeah. So it's a complete mess. So just out of curiosity, if a refugee who came to your center and they were charged with a crime or was convicted with a crime and you knew about it, would you still, like in Canada, not back in their home country, but in Canada, would your center still provide services to that refugee?
We've been fortunate enough to not actually be faced with this problem. So unfortunately, I cannot give you an answer from experience on that.
Hypothetically, if you knew about a charge with a refugee, like a refugee that received a criminal charge or was convicted of a crime, would you still provide services to?
I think that there would be a lot of questions for that person before we can decide whether or not to take on that case.
It's not a hard no.
It depends on the nature of the crime and if it was actually if it actually was committed instead of a wrongful charge.
What about crimes like maybe extortion or robbery, something like that nature? Would you consider taking on a refugee?
I don't think that I can give you a full answer on that. Unfortunately, our legal clinic would be the one to make the decision on that.
But you would still
30 seconds.
Provide resources in terms of legal clinic services to that refugee.
Providing the legal services would be up to the legal clinic itself. When it comes to other services, we don't necessarily look at people's criminal records when we provide them with language classes, for example.
A last question. Do you provide criminal defense services to refugees by any chance? No? Okay. Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Murad. Next, we have 5 minutes for Ms. Salma Zaid.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. My first question is for Madam Macklin. Thanks for coming. We have seen in recent years an erosion of public support for immigration here in Canada and to what we used to call the immigration consensus within the Canadians. So what would you suggest this committee could recommend to help rebuild that consensus and also restore trust in the system and help rebuild public support for immigration in Canada and the important role that immigrants can play helping to build and grow Canada's economy.
You're on mute. Please
thank
unmute
you.
yourself. Yes. You're good.
All good now? Okay. Thank you very much for that question. It's a great question. I think this is a real opportunity for leadership. I think that there are always going to be circulating in public discourse anti-immigrant narratives. They're always there, good times, bad times. The real question is who will pick them up, who exploits them, or who makes an effort to counter them. And that's a job of political leadership. And so I encourage from the top down, the government and all those in Parliament to take steps to counter the kind of dehumanization of non-citizens, the allegations that I think are ultimately weak, that, for example, newcomers are responsible for housing shortages. Housing shortages have a very complicated economic account about the financialization, among other things, of the housing industry. So, for example, to challenge that, to think about kind of countering, blaming, for example, international students for doing what international students do, which is study and to some extent work and reside in communities. So I think it is really important to not just take the existence of anti-immigrant narratives or things that blame newcomers for problems that are broad, social, complicated economic issues and run with them for political advantage, but rather to show leadership. And there are moments when the government has done that in the past, and I think it can do it again. And certainly with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement, I think it's time for the government to step up. And if we're all alarmed, as we should be, by what is being done in the United States to non-citizens, and we think that we are a better country in our attitudes and treatment of non-citizens, it's time to actually step up and demonstrate that by revoking the Safe Third Country Agreement. And instead of investing resources into, for example, CBSA, $1 billion to CBSA to militarize our border, to invest that into enabling safe, regular, and orderly entry of asylum seekers at the land borders in a way that is efficient and that serves the needs of both Canadians and asylum seekers. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. Ms. Morad, would you like to add something to this?
I think that my colleague said it beautifully. I don't have anything to add. Thank you very much.
For you, and then maybe we can ask Ms. Macklin to add too. How can the government balance the need for a stable and secure asylum system with our international and our moral obligations to assist those facing persecution and ensure everyone is treated with fairness and respect they need?
Thank you very much for that question. I would like to call attention to one of the recommendations that we spoke about today, which is the creation of additional complementary pathways. So the idea behind this is to prevent people from having to risk their lives in order to get to Canada, as well as to pair these people with our labor market needs. So this is a mutually beneficial agreement that would sort of limit the amount of danger and trauma that people have to go through and benefit Canada as well. Thank you.
Ms. Macklin, would you like to add to it?
Two things. One, we could reopen and invigorate the refugee sponsorship program, because not only was it good for refugees, it was really good for Canadians. It was really good for Canada. And this government has actually cut the numbers of refugee sponsorships available. That would be a really positive initiative. And I think in addition to that, as I said, the government can think about how to infuse enough resources into our asylum system that rather than it being a problem of backlogs, we are moving it forward as best as we can. The difficulty, and I'll emphasize this, and I understand the concern, we don't control what happens in the world that makes people have to seek refugee protection. And in that sense, we cannot control exactly how many people at any given moment are going to be seeking refugee protection from Canada. But that's not the fault of those seeking protection. And it's not a weakness of Canada. It's not a failure of sovereignty. It is a situation that calls for creativity, flexibility, and response to changing conditions worldwide.
Thank you so much, Professor Macklin. Thank you, Ms. Zaid. Après, on a 2 minutes et demie pour Monsieur Bruno.
And now for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Brunel Duceppe. Thank you, Chair. What would be the main challenges for organizations like yours working with asylum claimants? I mean, I understand the funding aspect, but are there other challenges, significant challenges for organizations like yours? Well, if you look at the proposals we have, the documentation is a key challenge, getting the relevant documents within the deadlines and that these documents are recognized. That's an issue. Our immigration system is a little complex. We agree on that. But there's a lack of knowledge, and government institutions such as schools, hospitals, and the personnel, they are having a hard time keeping up with all the changes, and they don't always have the capacity. So a lot of people end up being refused the services to which normally they should have access. So this documentation isn't uniform. There are many other types. So the idea that we're proposing is a secure ID card with a QR code. So that the lack of it, rather, is a significant challenge. Sometimes and quite often, we end up having to accompany people to their appointments. So Sweden has a similar system, right, as the one you have been describing, so we can get inspiration from that. So the clients or the claimants, rather, have you had cases where they have been exploited by criminal organizations and have had to cross the border illegally? Have you come across with many networks and criminal organizations who are exploiting maybe the Haitian community mostly? Well, at the center, we have not necessarily seen such examples, but we have heard stories, and it's certainly something that shifted with the closure of Roxham Road. But the more you close things down, the more you push people to avenues that they may not have taken had they had access to more regular ways. It hasn't been our direct experience, but it does exist. Thank you, Ms. Gracia Turgeon, and thank you, Mr. Brunel Duceppe.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Macklin, I just want to pick up on something my colleague, Mr. Ho, was talking about. For example, there was a trial for 3 men in Abbotsford that murdered an elderly couple, Arnold and Joanne de Jong. It started last month. And one of the accused is an Indian national who's in Canada on a student student visa. And so if someone like him chooses to make an asylum claim after the fact, once he's been charged with this, do you believe that they should be eligible to claim asylum, or should Canada be able to deport someone like that? You're muted.
You'd think I'd get the hang of this, man. Okay, so under Canadian law as it currently exists, that person would be ineligible to seek refugee protection.
We've seen this happen. For example, just last month in BC, there was a dozen, I think, people that were charged with extortion, I believe, in Surrey, and then they all turned around and claimed asylum.
If they are convicted, they are ineligible to make refugee claims.
Okay, so they weren't convicted yet, but obviously in the case of these 12, they clearly feared that. Do you think it's right for them to be able to claim asylum after being in the country for a while?
They can claim asylum. I don't know that it's right or wrong for them to be able to claim asylum, but they're not going to be eligible if they are convicted.
They're going to go through the process. It's going to take a number of years. They're going to claim a bunch of resources. They're going to be protected in Canada while they do that. Do you think that's fair to the rest of the citizens of Canada?
I think that you are misstating what is likely to happen. They've been charged with extortion. They will be tried for that offense. If they are convicted of that offense, they will be ineligible because the eligibility requirements make them ineligible. I don't think it would take years to determine eligibility. What may take time, and I don't know how long it would take, is the criminal process regarding extortion.
In your experience, do
that
people
charge.
like that? So let's follow that through and say that yes, they were deemed ineligible. In your experience, do people like that leave the country?
Certainly, if people have been convicted of offenses, they are likely to be deported because they're in custody. And so, for example, what typically happens is that they are if they're given a custodial sentence, then they are subject to removal from Canada virtually on the date of release from the custodial sentence. So they do tend to be removed.
We all know that the CBSA can only remove so many people. We have a very limited amount of people that get removed. So in your experience, do people hang around until they're actually removed, or do they voluntarily leave the country?
In the situation you described, if somebody is subject to a custodial sentence, they don't hang around. Typically, CBSA actually historically has prioritized people who are serving criminal sentences because they're frankly easy to find. They don't get released. They often end up being put immediately into immigration detention, which may or may not be, in fact, in a jail or in a detention center. So actually, those are the people probably most likely to be deported.
And yet, I think it wasn't that long ago we saw a report that said there were 34,000, I think, people in this status that were in our country that had not been deported yet. Do you recognize
Sorry.
that?
In what status? Do you mean people who have been convicted of criminal offenses?
Needed to be deported, but they weren't.
It's people who need to be deported. So that's a very large category. That includes most of those people have never been charged or convicted of a criminal offense. They're just people who are found to not have any legal status anymore for one reason or another. One of the challenges about that number, though, 34,000, is that Canada, like most countries, doesn't actually have exit controls. So the government may say that there are 34,000 people subject to removal. That is, removal notices have been issued. What the government doesn't know typically is how many of those people have actually left of their own accord because they don't check in with the government and say, hey, I'm leaving now. Now, number of those for sure will be in Canada.
Can I just interrupt for a second? We're going to run out of time. So do you think the government should be tracking who leaves the country?
I'm not sure it's feasible. The most the government currently does is track the people who leave overland from Canada to the United States. How do they do that? The United States documents people who enter the United States and then shares that information with Canada. That's how Canada registers who leaves.
It's not possible for Canada to have the technology or the capability of doing that? Is that what you're saying? Or is it necessary? A better question is it necessary?
You know, the truth is I don't have a strong opinion about it. If Canada wants to invest in the technology to detect who leaves the country through airports and land borders, it's certainly possible to do it. Whether you think it's worth the investment or not is a question that I haven't given enough thought to give a definitive answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Macklin. Thank you, Mr. Redikoff. And now we go to end this round. We go 5 minutes to Ms. Zaid. Mr. Zuberi, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the witnesses, I'll this time go with the Refugee Center. And I have a few questions for you. Ms. Murad, I know that you've written about narratives and how important it is to have positive narratives, or accurate narratives, I should say, around immigrants and refugees. And you did reply to my colleague, MP Zahid, about narratives. But I'd like to just pick up about the contributions. If you can talk a bit about the contributions that refugees make, asylum seekers make to Canada and our society.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think when most people think of the contributions to Canada that refugee claimants can make, they think of the labor force. That is definitely an undeniable fact. Refugee claimants do, in fact, support Canada through taxes, through their labor. Refugee claimants actually are very competitive, especially in the province of Quebec, with economic migrants. Refugee claimants are more likely to be entrepreneurs and to start their own businesses in Canada, bringing new cultures, bringing new perspectives, and this is definitely a benefit to Canada. A story that I think everyone may be familiar with is Peace by Chocolate. That is definitely a success story and a great narrative to call attention to here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've seen that piece for chocolates in different bookstores in the West Island of Montreal. I'm sure it's many different places around the country. Really interesting business. But I wanted to just kind of rewind a bit, and just if we can take a moment and imagine, all of us, how it is for somebody to enter your offices, somebody that's seeking your resources. Can you share with us how the energy and the situation that people are in when they first come to you, and then how you help them understand the system, help them have confidence in the system that is our Canadian system? If you can share a bit about that, their energy, and how you help them along the way and educate them.
Thank you. Their energy, I think it does change, of course. There is a wide range from being very excited at the opportunities that being in Canada can bring, as well as being very maybe nervous and bringing past traumas with them through the door. Certain things are very, very difficult for people to shake. Paranoia is definitely something that is present. The ways that we sort of help people navigate the system, we have many different workshops, portal workshops that help them understand what the system is and how it functions. Of course, there are barriers with this, and so we try our best to overcome them. Barriers like digital literacy, for example. Majority of the process is online. And so having people at the center to help them and show them how it works, show them what the goal is, I guess, here is a definite benefit to them.
So you describe people who are deeply vulnerable coming with trauma, that you see much more than as in comparison to the average Canadian.
Absolutely.
And when it comes to services like housing, je sais aussi, Madame Garcia Turgan.
I know that Ms. Gracia Turgeon, you talked about services, the various services available for the clients, for the claimants. How can you help the claimants access these services? Well, for housing in Quebec, we are lucky to have a sort of a welcome center that not all of the other provinces have. So we get into contact with them from the initial moment that they come here. Not everyone, unfortunately, can have access to the service, but we are working with some of them through this mechanism. We also have the transitional housing, so apartments, co-location apartments across Montreal. They have 6 months in these apartments. Often these people, of course, will not have a credit history, so owners do not want to rent their apartments to an individual who don't have a credit history. So we try to give them that initial 6 months of the initial co-location experience and credit history experience. And in parallel to this, we assist them in their job-seeking endeavors. So once they leave this transitional housing to go to their own apartment, hopefully they are also matched with a job and they have all the tools to be autonomous.
Madame Garcia Turgeon.
Thank you, Ms. Gracia Turgeon.
That ends our first panel for today. And so I want to thank the witnesses for your time, all of you, and I want to thank you for your important contribution to the study today. We're now going to suspend for 5 to 10 minutes, just so that we can have the current witnesses leave, and then we could set up for the second panel. Nous sommes de retour.
So we are back.
You will mention this to me. We will have a hard stop at 6:30, so do not fret for those who have hot dates or have to meet planes. But I will make a few comments for the benefit of our new witnesses. For those on Zoom, hello, Mr. Oldman. Kindly click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. As well, at the bottom of your screen, you could select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either Floor English or French. And for those in the room, of course, you all know that you can use your earpiece and select the desired channel. Kindly, as always, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking, and all comments should be addressed through the chair. I now would like to warmly welcome our witnesses for the second panel. As an individual, we have Professor Christopher Warswick, Professor, Department of Economics, Carleton University. Welcome, Professor Warswick. By video conference on behalf of the Immigrant Services Society of British Columbia, we have Mr. Jonathan Oldman, Chief Executive Officer. Warm welcome to you. And finally, last but not least, we have for the Immigrants Working Center, we have the Executive Director, Mr. Luc Bonaventure Amoussou. Bienvenue à vous. So each one of you will be given 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. And so I will just start with Professor Warswick for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a professor in the Department of Economics at Carleton University. My research is on the economics of immigration, and I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to present on this topic, immigration processes in Canada. So this is a very broad topic, and given I have 5 minutes for an opening statement, I'm just going to focus what I think is the most sort of pressing question related to the economic immigration process, specifically the selection of economic principal applicants. So since the late 1960s, Canada has employed mainly a human capital-based model of immigrant selection. Specifically, we have chosen economic principal applicants who have had education and language fluency, which makes them likely to have high earnings, perhaps not in the first year or two in Canada after arrival, but within a reasonable time frame. I co-authored a 2025 study published in the Canadian Journal of Economics with Matt Doyle and Mikhail Skruderud, in which we make the case that if one wants to maximize economic welfare, usually measured by economists at least as GDP per capita, one would select economic principal applicants whose earnings 10 years after arrival in Canada are expected to be above the population average. As a rule of thumb, that's a sensible way to approach economic immigration. Can this be done? I am certain it can if we take immigrant selection seriously. If we look at the immigrant applicants and rank them based on factors such as education and language fluency, and then drill down into key details of education, such as field of study, we will have much better outcomes for the strong applicants we would select. We might end up with a smaller economic intake, but it would be a much more successful one. Now, many of you may be thinking that this is more or less what we do, but I would argue that we have shifted a long way from that. The category-based selection system allows governments to move away from prioritizing the highest earnings immigrants so as to pursue other policy options. Similarly, the growing provincial nominee numbers too often are focused on lower-skill economic immigrants, and this is another way where we are seeing significant drift from a former human capital-based model. While the potential pool of people wanting to come to Canada to live is arguably very large, many of them lack the language fluency and education needed to have higher earnings in Canada. So what does this mean in practice? Well, fundamental to economics is the idea of making choice under scarcity. We need to start thinking about highly skilled economic principal applicants as being scarce. I think only when we see that, only when we do that will we see the layering on of other policy objectives like francophone targets for economic immigrants settling outside of Quebec, or prioritizing economic immigrants who will settle in small communities under provincial nominee programs. Layering these on top of the human capital model are pushing us away from our fundamental goal of raising GDP per capita and are costing our economy. So I thought I would try a couple of quick analogies. So Prime Minister Carney often uses hockey analogies, so I thought I would try one, just to lighten things up maybe. We are heading into the Winter Olympics. So let's say we had decided that the women's hockey team, rather than being based on the best available players, was based on the best available players while ensuring that at least one player comes from each province and territory. That might have value as a policy, right, as these individual women would be great role models for people in their communities. But I think everyone realizes that would probably reduce the chances, perhaps dramatically, of winning Olympic gold. And so there's no serious discussion of that. But I would argue this is in the same spirit to our provincial nominee programs. Similarly,
1 minute.
Sorry? Okay. Similarly, what if the Government of Canada required that professional basketball players needed to be bilingual? It's pretty extreme. I was thinking English-French, not English-Spanish, so it's even more extreme. This policy would greatly limit the choice that the Blue Jays organization would have and greatly reduce their chances of winning the World Series. But I would argue this is in the same spirit as our Francophone targets outside of Quebec. To be clear, settling Francophone immigrants inside Quebec makes perfect sense. I'm not critical of that. For economic immigrants settling outside of Quebec, restricting some fraction to be Francophone is very unlikely to have any impact on those communities. And yet to achieve this, we may have to divert away from outstanding unilingual, Anglophone, or Allophone applicants. Ideally, the selection of economic principal applicants should be focused on individuals who will have above average earnings in Canada within, say, 10 years of arrival. When other policy objectives are introduced, we should expect lower earnings, performance of the immigrants settled. We should also be honest and upfront about the trade-offs involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Warswick. Now we are going to turn to Mr. Oldman from Immigrant Services Society of British Columbia. Please, 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. So I'm speaking to you as CEO of Immigrant Services Society of BC, or ISS of BC, as a founding member of the Canada We Believe in initiative, and as a first-generation immigrant myself. For 50 years, ISS of BC has helped newcomers build lives in Canada. Each year, thousands turn to us to find work, settle into local communities, and improve their language skills. We're part of a vibrant settlement sector rooted in communities right across the country. Today, however, we collectively face uncertainty and skepticism. Public discourse has shifted from healthy debate based on underlying consensus to one that is increasingly divisive. The narrative is highly focused on themes of control and security, and our system is too often framed as literally broken. Pressures on social infrastructure are frequently presented in an oversimplified way that inaccurately attributes them wholly to immigration. We're even seeing anti-immigration rhetoric being imported from outside Canada that undermines our values and targets newcomer communities. Public opinion data paints a picture of reducing confidence in economic and social capacity, support for refugees, and newcomer integration. However, research also shows that the more people know about the facts behind immigration, the less concerned they are. Fundamentally, Canadians believe in the positive impact of immigration. So, what's missing to help Canadians regain confidence? For many of us, it's a renewed positive vision for immigration, one that reaffirms how a successful immigration strategy is central to Canada's future prosperity, diversity, and sustainability. Nearly 200 diverse civil society, business, and community organizations from across the country endorsed the Canada We Believe in call for just such a renewed vision. It's grounded in 5 key principles. Firstly, clearer, more streamlined integration programs that drive economic growth. Today, our system is still confusing and too fragmented. Meanwhile, here in British Columbia, for example, with slower immigration and population growth, labor demand is now projected to exceed supply by nearly 170,000 people over the coming decade. Secondly, whole-of-government coordination to align immigration with demographic trends and labor force demand, and to ensure the necessary community investment. Today, we're still treating these as separate conversations when they are deeply intertwined. Thirdly, repudiation of divisive and counterfactual anti-immigration rhetoric. In Canada, we may speak many languages and come from many places, but across our differences, we look out for each other. Fourthly, a recommitment to strong humanitarian programs that continue to transform lives and uphold our international standing. Today, too many Canadians are unclear about how different refugee streams work, how we meet our goals and obligations, and how supporting refugees brings communities together. And lastly, and importantly, transparent measures of success that establish clear economic, social, and global impacts with outcomes reported back to Canadians. Success defined predominantly in terms of total arrivals and population rates isn't sufficient anymore. Launched last April, our call is even more urgent today. Now, over the course of these hearings, you've heard different specific policy suggestions. However, you've also heard from others, as well as from an increasing number of voices in media, policy, and business circles, that now is the time for a bigger conversation on immigration. We also hear this in day-to-day conversations with ordinary Canadians. So we urge the committee to make two baseline recommendations. Firstly, transform the current levels plan process to a whole-of-government, whole-of-society approach that coordinates and aligns all the strategic elements and stakeholders. And secondly, endorsement of the 5 Canada We Believe in principles as the baseline for a renewed vision. The time for a reset is now. Canada's future depends on it. To end, let me tell you about Ibrahim, a young refugee from Yemen and a protected person here in Canada. Presented in a certain light, these few words about him may create very particular images and judgments. But what we also need to know about Ibrahim is that he's a software developer, a budding entrepreneur, and a community volunteer. I left everything behind, he told me when we spoke recently, but I believed Canada could be a place where I could build a life again. We owe Ibrahim a similarly positive vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Oldman. And lastly, but not least, we have Monsieur Amoussou. Oui, c'est à vous, 5 minutes.
Merci. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Luc Amoussou, Executive Director of the Immigrant Working Center and Vice President of the Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario. It is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the City of Hamilton and the Immigrant Working Center, an organization that has supported newcomers for more than 38 years. I speak to you today not only as a leader in the settlement sector, but as someone who has lived the Canadian immigration story. With over 25 years of experience in international mobility, including experience at UN, I can say with confidence that Canada remains one of the most welcoming and attractive destinations in the world. From the perspective of IWC, immigration is much more than a social success. It is an economic necessity for Canada. According to IRCC projection, immigration will account for almost 100% of Canada's labor force growth by 2030. And by 2032, it is projected to account for 100% of our population growth. For Hamilton and for Canada, immigration is not optional. It is essential to our economic future. The question today is no longer whether Canada can welcome newcomers, but how we welcome them, how we ensure that they are not blamed for broader social challenges, and how we help them integrate successfully into our communities and our labor market. Yet our capacity to support newcomers is being tested. While the stabilization of immigration levels announced in November 2024 is understandable, but the budget cuts introduced in April 2025 have placed our sector and our clients under immense strain. These cuts have weakened essential services and amplified the mental health pressure faced by newcomers. We must be clear on one point. Immigration is permanent. The founding that support integration must also be permanent. Project-based funding create gaps, staff turnover, and service instability. Essential service cannot depend on short-term pilot. So we strongly recommend a return to a 5-year funding cycle for the settlement sector, along with adding 2 more years to the current agreement. As frontline organization working with thousands of newcomers each year, we see firsthand how Canada immigration processes shape their early experiences. Newcomers regularly face complex documentation requirements, unclear instructions, digital barriers, along with long processing timelines. Even small errors can delay application by months, leading to job loss, financial hardship, family separation, and serious impact on mental health. In recent months, we have seen a significant rise in mental vulnerability among our clients. Settlement agencies like us play a crucial role in helping newcomers navigate these challenges.
1 minute.
Stronger collaboration between IRCC and the settlement sector would help address some important issues. And let me highlight 4 of them: reducing digital and language barriers, improving communication with frontline partners, reviewing the impact of AI-based processing tools, ensuring the application instructions are clear, complete, and consistent. Settlement organizations are not only providers, we are partners. By working with IRCC and the settlement sector, we can make Canada's system more efficient. Let me end with this. Canada's economic success depends on immigration, and immigration success depends on a strong, stable, and properly funded settlement services. When newcomers succeed, Canada succeeds with them. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur Moussou. Thank you to everyone for their opening comments. Now we are going to go to rounds of questions. We'll begin with Mr. Redekop for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. I'm going to start with Professor Warswick. So you talked about the way that the government has gone towards category-based selection, and then further talked about how they've added other factors like language. So is it fair to summarize your initial comments by saying we're doing it wrong?
I think we are moving in the wrong direction on immigrant selection. I think that's fair to say. I've focused on category-based selection and provincial nominee programs, but I think we had a model that was working quite well, and it was in place certainly through 2015, let's say, and the changes since then in general have been problematic in terms of selecting economic immigrants.
I'm curious on the language, because I understand what you're saying that we have a lower score based on which language you speak. How do you integrate, for example, the French language then into selection of people based on using the you talked about greater than average earnings or whatever category? How do you integrate language into something like that?
Well, I think we have a comprehensive ranking system that applies to many of but not all of the economic programs. I think that needs to be updated. It was meant to be a rolling update process, but when it was originally created, economists at StatCan, I believe, looked at earnings of immigrants up to that point and said what factors seem to affect earnings performance. So you could go back and do that again, and if you find that French language fluency raises earnings appreciably in Vancouver, then that should be part of the process. But it should be a data-driven exercise. And so, I think skill has become controversial, what skill is. But what economists think about as human capital is usually measured in terms of earnings. And I would suggest we could take a lot of the politics out of it by agreeing on what the policy goals are and then let the data drive it.
I believe 3 years ago I saw an article that you wrote where you essentially warned the government that a crisis was coming. Am I correct in that? And what was the logic of that?
Well, the article I referenced with Mikhail Skruder and Matt Doyle was something we started around that time. So it's possible it was an early version of that paper. I mean, I think we were concerned about the growing numbers, the growing level of permanent immigration. Now, I think what ended up becoming a bigger problem was the extraordinary growth of the temporary migration. But I think both changes combined really led to, a surge in the population, which is really unprecedented since the 50s anyways. And I think it strained our ability to settle. I'm sympathetic to my colleague here's challenges. It must be extremely difficult. So I think it's a mixture of levels, which I know is a different part of the study, but also selection, right? And I think, we talk, my colleague here mentioned completely correctly that, labor force growth is going to come from immigration. But it's not just the number of workers that matters. It also is earnings. Like if we're trying to fund social programs, it's not the number of people, it's how successful they are. And I just want to really make clear that I'm talking about economic programs. I strongly support refugee programs, and we need services to support refugees and family class. I just like to see us need them less for economic immigrants.
So you mentioned levels, so let's talk a bit about that. Do you think that our levels should be constrained by things like housing availability and those types of things?
I think the levels, ideally, the short answer is yes, I think it should. But if we should be able to build housing and we should be able to build healthcare to match immigration, but we've struggled to do that, certainly in the last 20 years. I said that one of the rules of thumb that we've come up with is to say, well, look at your pool of applicants and take the economic principal applicants you think 10 years from now are going to have earnings above average. Well, that assumes that you can build homes if there's a large number of people. If you can't, then it's hard to see why this, I think you would trim back the level. Not drastically cut, but you'd have an adjustment factor.
Mr. Amasu, we have approximately 3 million temporary residents in our country right now. The government has many plans to essentially expire their paperwork, and then they expect them to leave the country. In your experience, when a temporary resident's paperwork expires, essentially, do they leave the country, or do you run into folks who hang around after their paperwork has expired?
Yeah, if they have a temporary resident permit, what ends up happening most of the time is that they tend to not leave. But when compelled, they do so. And most of the time, they will go try to fight and then claim that they have a right to stay here. And as a rule of thumb from IWC, we encourage them to abide by the rules, meaning when it is time to leave and you have expired, whatever means you can use to appeal, just leave.
So from a realistic perspective, is it realistic for the government to expect these people to leave the country, or as you said, are they just going to try to find a way to stay?
I think they should go by the rules. So the expectation is that if they have exhausted them,
Right.
they should leave.
Okay, but they should. But in your experience, will they?
Yeah, they do. Some do.
Some.
Yes.
But not all.
Most of the time, they won't do it, yes. But
Most
some
of
will
the-
do.
Yeah, they will.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Redekop. Thank you, Mr. Amosul. Next, we have 5 minutes for Mr. Peter Fredescatos.
Thank you.
So sorry, 6 minutes.
That's fine, Madam Chair. No problem. Professor Worswick, thank you very much for being here today. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I think we're all hockey fans at this table. It's very Canadian game, obviously by definition. I think analogies have their place. But if I take your analogy to its logical conclusion, look, you're talking about ultimately differences of degree and not kind. And what I mean by that, if we're going to continue down that path of the analogy, a right-winger and a centerman are different, but not really. I mean, they're hockey players in the end. And if we're thinking about the economy and the place of the immigration system in helping to build up that economy, where obviously individuals can't be sourced, we're talking about skills, individuals can't be sourced domestically, then I think your analogy and your overall argument, frankly, might be out of place. Just tell me a little bit more, because I'm a bit confused on the rationale. I say this with great respect. If we're trying to fulfill skills gaps, if we're trying to address rather skills gaps in the economy, obviously you're going to want people of various backgrounds, including income types. The trades is a challenge. It's hard to source people in the trades. To give one example, you talk to business owners in rural and remote communities. They have a very difficult time finding people. And so if we're going to source people of only one income type or in a certain category of income, if you like, then I think we're going to run into problems. The immigration system should serve the economy first and foremost. Yeah, of course.
So, okay, really quickly, I know there's not a lot of time. So, in the absence of an immigration program, when there's excess demand for workers, the wages should rise. That's what Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations. And my experience is if a job has chronic labor shortages, usually it's because there's something to do with the job that people don't like. And so this idea that we should have immigrants do the jobs Canadians don't want to do, I think is a huge mistake because the wages will never rise if that's the case. So, I think the solution, and like my colleague, Mikkel Skruderud, has put out numbers on construction. Everyone's always saying there's construction shortages, but we do not see wages rising rapidly in construction.
Sir, I have limited time. I don't want to interrupt you, and in fact, I'd be quite happy to follow up after the meeting. But what would you tell, for example, members of Parliament from Atlantic Canada, who in their communities have fish processing plants, to give you an example? The problem with those plants is not that they're not getting orders. They're getting many orders from across Canada, from across the world. They can't fill those orders because they have such a challenge getting access to workers.
Right, and I'm sure that they feel that way, but let me please answer.
It's not that they feel that way. This is an objective fact.
Can I answer the question?
It's a fact. So
you keep interrupting me.
No, I'm just putting facts on the record. If we're going to have a discussion,
just please allow the witness to respond, please.
So the wages should rise until local people or people from Ontario or people from BC want to move there to do the jobs, or the companies invest in new technology. Right? These fish plants. Companies, like we have temporary foreign workers coming in to work in fast food restaurants in Toronto. Are there not workers in Toronto? The wages have to rise, and what that does raises wages for low-income Canadians, and it reduces income inequality.
I take your point, sir, on Toronto and in particular the fast food sector. But you're telling me that the fish plant example that I gave, we're going to tell the entrepreneurs that run those places that they should wait for workers from Ontario, so Canadians from Ontario, to move out there.
Off by saying,
at some point they'll realize that they suddenly want to go work in Atlantic Canada in a fish processing plant.
I said local workers could take the jobs first.
That's the challenge.
Because the wage hasn't risen yet.
Okay, so that's the answer to this. Just
that is the answer.
Increase wages.
That's
and
what we did in Canada for the first 100 years, right? We didn't have temporary foreign worker programs. Okay. And on your other question about left wing, right wing, center, I had a look at the public use census file today for 2021. I restricted it to economic immigrants in Canada. If you compare economic immigrants who work in French in Canada outside Quebec to all other immigrants, economic immigrants who work in English and any other language, their earnings are 20% lower. That's straight from the census. So there's real costs to these policies we're laying over top, and that means that they're paying less taxes, they may need more services, and that's costing Canadians.
1 minute.
Thank you. As I said, Professor Worswick, happy to follow up with you afterwards. Merci d'être ici, Monsieur Ramassou. Premièrement,
Mr. Ramassou, thanks for being here. We are a bilingual country, and we are very proud with this fact. Do you think that the immigration system plays an important role in this vision? Absolutely, because being a country with 2 official languages puts the IRCC in a position to promote both languages. You can have programs to learn English and programs to learn French. It is an exceptional opportunity that Canada is offering, investing in language training of newcomers. It's very important. And I always tell people we should try to be bilingual or multilingual. It is really a good asset to have, and that is something the IRCC takes also into account, training in the both official languages of the country.
Next, we have 6 6 minutes for Monsieur Brunet-Ducel.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we want to stay with the hockey analogies, yes, the Prime Minister of Canada, as well as his Liberal troops, have been using the term elbows up but in English, elbows up, it might refer to protecting oneself in hockey, but the French direct translation actually refers more to a drinking game almost. So if we are to underline the diversity of this place, we need to be careful with translating slogans. They don't always keep the same meaning. So, Mr. Warswick, you said in your opening remarks that immigration outside of Quebec, that would maybe stray us away from our economic objectives. Maybe I wasn't clear on that.
Could you repeat the question?
Oui, est-ce que j'avais bien compris?
So did I understand it right? During your opening remarks, you said that criteria such as Francophone immigration outside of Quebec, it would slow down our economic progress, or it would distance us from our economic objectives?
I think my concern is it would lead to an intake of economic immigrants to Canada, but not in Quebec, who would have lower human capital on average. They would have lower earnings. They would pay less taxes. That's what I'm getting at.
Est-ce que vous croyez?
Do you believe in the vitality of Francophone communities outside of Quebec?
I think that's important, but I'm far from confident that this policy would help that. That's my concern. I mean, I think we're not able to target permanent immigrants to particular spots. With temporary migrants, we have more control. So you might bring someone to Toronto who is Francophone. They may not interact very much with other Francophone or individuals wanting to speak French. And then they have the right to move to Montreal or Quebec City because they're permanent residents. These are my concerns about that.
I understand the thought you are putting forward. Doesn't mean that we agree on that, but would it be the same, the opposite way? So Anglophone immigration in Quebec, would it also harm our economic objectives?
Parce que si c'est vrai pour
I think I understand your question. Sorry.
Pitou, c'est vrai pour Minou. Bonne chance avec ça.
Because the opposite should also be true. If you're claiming one thing, the opposite should be also true.
I wasn't planning to come to talk about the Quebec selection system today, so I'm not suggesting...
Non, peut-être qu'on s'est mal compris. Je parle vraiment, parce que vous avez vraiment...
You said, roughly, that Francophone immigration outside of Quebec is harmful for our economic objectives. So I'm asking you if the opposite is also correct. So Anglophone immigration in Quebec, is it also harmful to our economic objectives?
I would say it would be if the Anglophones going to Quebec under the federal system, I'm guessing, have lower earnings. I'm agnostic on the language issue. Okay, I think what the federal program should be geared to generating earnings of immigrants 10 years out that are above average. And so I really come down to whether if that's not happening, then I would agree, then it's a problem.
Je suggère très humblement et vous.
So I will submit humbly the following. The language issue is quite sensitive, especially in official language minority communities outside of Quebec. And Francophone immigration outside of Quebec for Francophones outside of Quebec is eminently important. It's even vital for the survival and the growth of their populations. So we shouldn't just have an economic lens on this issue, in my opinion. Of course, there's economic potential in all this. I mean, take this as you will. This is not really a value judgment, but it is important in a country that claims to have 2 official languages to also put the spotlight on official language minority communities, which brings me, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to move on to you, sir. What are the main obstacles that newcomers are experiencing in the first stages of the immigration procedure? Well, the first obstacles, it's about finding a job which corresponds to their skills, which really appreciates what they are, what they know, so not precarious work. Of course, it could take some time before they reach their full potential, especially in Ontario. Housing has become a problem. Not having a credit history is, of course, a big challenge, and people are being asked for up to 6 months of deposit before they can rent a place. And for Francophones in general, for allophones as well, it's learning the language or the languages, learning English in this case. It takes at least 4 years of investment in some situations. So as long as it's not done, it keeps delaying the economic integration of these individuals. Thank you, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Thank you, Mr. Amoussoun.
For a second round, it's 5 minutes, and we begin with Mr. Fred Davies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor, I'd like to follow up on a couple of things because it's piqued my interest in your thesis on how wages need to rise in order to attract labor. In your view, have you looked at the current Canadian immigration policy? Is the policy as it's being delivered now on a broad basis suppressing wages?
I think that an argument could be made, and I have another paper from 2020 in the Canadian Journal of Economics that looked at the temporary foreign worker program using data circa from like the Harper government period, not on the most recent period. And we came up with a theoretical model and empirical evidence that suggests that the temporary foreign worker program could be suppressing wages and lowering wages. I think the bigger concern probably is, do we see wage growth? Like, are we stopping the wage growth? Or is it lowering wages? I'm not so sure. But I think I would be concerned that wages are not growing, that labor shortages are becoming chronic, or so-called labor shortages are becoming chronic, and we're relying on temporary foreign worker programs and less skilled permanent immigration to solve a problem that in many countries is addressed just through wage growth. And at the same time, I hear people, well-intentioned people complaining about poverty rates and income inequality. And yet the best way to fix these problems is through wage growth. And yet we have anyway, I'll stop there.
No, it's okay, because I want to cover a couple of areas, and I have limited time. But do you see any regional differences in the way wages are growing or not growing? You see a disproportionate...
It's a good question. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm guessing wages are probably growing faster in Alberta, but I just because of the strength of the resource sector there, I'd have to look at the numbers to know for sure. So you had mentioned the skills gaps, or one of you mentioned skills gap. And I'm hopeful that you've been following what's been happening in the post-secondary sector, where there have been sort of puppy mills of students coming into the country, and the committee has studied this in quite some depth. But one of the issues and one of the problems I've seen is the government changed how graduates can get and maintain a job and a path to permanent residency. That's effectively stopped now. In my riding, I've got Niagara College, which is a very significant educational institution. They've got a world-class culinary arts program, brewing program, distilling program, and that's a 2-, 3-, and 4-year program.
it used to be the case that you could get a work permit for the equivalency of the time you were in school. Now, if you graduate, you have to leave. Now, I happen to own a brewery, so I'm looking for brewers all the time, but I can't get them now, especially in this program, because the people that graduate have to leave. But yet, a person who gets not to disrespect the liberal arts, but if you have a degree in sociology, you can still stay for the equivalent time of your education. Do you see that as a problem, and would you make recommendations to change that?
Just really quickly, because I know there's not a lot of time. I have written a few Globe and Mail opinion pieces on these issues, and I'm happy to chat afterwards. I think I'm pretty consistent on this. I actually think international students are great for Canada. We just have to get the design and the balance right. And I think whether someone stays or not, I would use the same criteria I've been talking about for the economic immigration program. At least permanently, I think an international student should stay as an economic immigrant if we think 10 years from now their earnings are going to be above average. So that's going to be true of some college programs. That's going to be true of some university, but not all university programs. And I think that's the fair way to do it, because otherwise you're going to say, oh, you're a university professor, you're favoring the universities. I think we should let the data drive it.
Just anecdotally, because I can tell you that you're absolutely right about the impact of wage growth. We have seen substantial growth in wages in the sector that I'm in, simply because we can't find the labor. So you do end up paying more for labor, and it does then fixes it attracts people. They do get paid more, and I think, as you had mentioned, that you are looking, your research suggests that immigration policy should provide a 10-year above average of the current wages.
Sorry, thank you,
period.
Mr. Davies. Sorry, Professor Worswick.
I'm
I
sorry.
think we're over.
Okay.
We're over. So you can ask for the next one if that's okay. Okay, now we have 5 minutes for Mr. Zuberi.
I'll start off with Professor Worswick. I'm just wondering, are you familiar with the context of Quebec and employment for immigrants?
I lost the last sentence.
I'm just curious, are you familiar with the context in Quebec as it relates to immigrant communities and employment?
Somewhat. I'm probably not as well aware as the rest of the country.
I can appreciate that, given where you're situated. Are you familiar with the headlines in broad strokes, would you say?
I think so.
Okay. Are you familiar that of numerous studies that have indicated that those who are Maghrébin or North African in origin have a very high unemployment rate as compared to the average immigrant and the average person in the population of Quebec?
I haven't seen numbers, but it doesn't surprise me to hear that, sadly. I'm sorry?
I'm assuming you're not familiar with that.
I haven't seen the numbers recently.
Okay. The only reason why I mentioned this is because I wanted to pivot maybe to Monsieur Amoussou, désolé. Monsieur Amoussou, nous sommes racisés et on sait que
we are racialized, and we see that these communities sometimes have challenges that others don't have. Accents, recognition of credentials, education history, etc. And this phenomenon exists across the country, not just in one province.
Is that something you've seen in your practice?
Absolument, il faut le reconnaître que quelque part.
Absolutely, we have to recognize this fact. We are not always faced with the same circumstances, and when you are an immigrant, everything becomes harder because you are immigrants, because you're a new generation here, and it takes 10 years for a newcomer to catch up to the level of someone born in Canada. So as soon as you step foot here, you have 10 years of catching up to do, regardless of your education level. And the integration process could maybe help to drop that from 10 to 5 years, but it's still a big challenge. So someone born in Canada compared to someone born in Algeria or in Benin, they come here, they have the same education, they have the same diploma, let's say, and they are facing a 10-year gap. And yes, we want to achieve economic success, but there's also the human aspect to this. So what we are doing is to facilitate the procedure so that these people get to the point faster where they can contribute to Canada's economic progress. It's not just a question of picking one path and then leading to a certain salary level, and it doesn't project the right image for our country.
Salaried employee, regardless of income, they're still paying taxes. I'd like to go to Mr. Oldman and just very briefly ask, very simple, because I have other questions to ask you, or another question. Do you agree with what you just heard in terms of the testimony that was given?
Well, I think there's been some really interesting debate, and I think it illustrates the fact that a bigger conversation about immigration is required. I mean, I do think that there are some complicated issues here. I think that there are some limitations to an approach to economic migration that is simply based on maximizing earnings. If I think here in British Columbia, and I think across the country about our healthcare system, a quarter of healthcare workers across the country, I believe, are foreign trained or born overseas. And when you think about the average per capita revenue salary of Canadians, and then you think about care aid workers and home support workers, and the shortage that we have in those groups, then raising those wages is not a practical solution. And raising wages is not a practical solution to demographics and population projections. You can offer to pay people as much as you want, but if the population is declining, the working population is declining, then we have a demographic problem. So I appreciate the economic arguments and the theories that the professor is putting forward, and I think they have a place, but I don't think it's not the entire equation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Oldman. Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Maintenant, on a 2 minutes et demie pour Monsieur Brunel.
Mr. Brunel-Doucet for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Amusu, I am from the north of Quebec, Lac Saint-Jean region. So we have more and more newcomers coming to our neck of the woods. And our office sometimes serves as an extension office for the IRCC because people can simply not talk to someone at the department. So people sometimes are lost in these procedures and they simply cannot be accompanied with regard to these federal procedures, and they don't have access to direct services. Is that a problem that you have seen? It is indeed a problem, and it has become worse with the use of artificial intelligence tools because they are having to interface with machines and not human beings. And as soon as there's the slightest error in a form, for instance, they fill out, it snowballs. And sometimes people are having to spend hours on the phone before they can speak to someone from the IRCC, so they turn to partner organizations like ours. So we shouldn't head towards an artificial intelligence-based system only. There are sometimes vulnerable individuals with language challenges, but they have to talk to robots and.
The camera is not functioning properly. I don't know if we need to knock the guys back there to wake them up, but it's not showing the witness.
Ouais, on l'aime beaucoup, Peter, mais pas tant que ça. Là.
Oh, I could see the witness.
We like Peter, but maybe not.
Oh, the camera. Oh.
Yeah, it was on the lovely Liberal group there.
Now, I think that's changed
Maybe
now.
it's fixed. Maybe.
Thank you. Thank you. Still finished at 6:30.
Donc, je finis mon tour. OK.
Okay, so I'll finish my round. And you're right. the IRCC has to be the most humane department, but it ends up being the exact opposite. They used to have offices, like unemployment services offices, where people could show up. I mean, maybe we could take inspiration from good examples, good practices that we had in the past. Yes, absolutely, because we have vulnerable clients with language challenges, and speaking to an actual human being is much better for them than interfacing with AI. Thank you, Mr. Amusu. Thank you, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe.
Left. So I will give 2 minutes to Mr. Cram and 2 minutes to Ms. Tesser-Dirksen. Mr. Cran.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Warswick, we don't have much time, so let's hop right into it. So I read with interest a mainstream media article last fall all about temporary foreign workers, in which you were quoted quite a few times. And you raised the concern in the article about, it said, quote, the growing reliance on temporary workers can have long-term consequences, including wage suppression. Can you elaborate on how the TFW program can suppress wages?
Sure. So the temporary foreign worker program, the way it's supposed to work is that a firm advertises a job at if they advertise a job at the market wage rate and they're unsuccessful, they can ask the federal government to bring in a temporary foreign worker. That seems innocuous, but the reality is job searches fail all the time, and this could lead to a situation whereby there's just an incredible supply, sadly, of lower wage workers around the world willing to come. And so one could think of it as flattening the labor supply curve effectively through that. Now, the other thing that could happen is that firms could anticipate this, right? Because temporary foreign workers tend to be older, they tend to be than teenage workers in Canada. They care a lot more about the job. If they lose the job, they probably have to go back to their home country, whereas an immigrant, for example, a PR, permanent resident, can move to another job in Canada. So there's a power imbalance. So our research suggests this type of program is likely to lead to lower wage offers by firms.
And spoiler alert, at the end of the article, you had a recommendation about what should be done with the temporary foreign worker program. Would you like to elaborate here today?
In 20 seconds.
We should eliminate the temporary foreign worker program. We should have permanent immigration, and the economic component should be focused at high income individuals, and then we should train permanent residents and Canadian citizens to do other jobs if there's shortages.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Cram. The last 2 minutes to you, Ms. Tesser-Dirksen.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair, and thanks everyone for letting me sit in as a guest and indulging me and allowing me to ask a question. For Mr. Oldman, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you had 2 recommendations. One of them was, I'm paraphrasing, to transform the levels plan so that it became more holistic. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you meant by that.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So the levels plan process today is one that takes in a lot of feedback, but we're hearing conversations across communities and across the different sectors that a longer-term cross-government process be considered, one that is led, and you've heard this from other witnesses at other meetings as well, that is coordinated and aligned across government, not just IRCC, and that the different immigration streams there's complementarity and alignment between that, and that there's a more structured and influential whole of society input into levels planning. Right now, there is extensive consultation that's done by IRCC, but it's not a whole of government and not a whole of society process. And what we see in the coverage and the communication of the levels plan is it's frequently reduced to 2 numbers, and that one of the recommendations from the Canada We Believe In initiative is setting much clearer strategic objectives for different economic and humanitarian and other streams of immigration?
I think that's time. Thank you so much, Ms. Tesser-Dirksen, and thank you, Mr. Oldman. I want to thank all the witnesses for both their time and the important contributions. There may be some additional, based on this excellent conversation, there may be some additional things you want to submit to the committee. I encourage you to do that. That's all three of you. And thanks again. But before we adjourn, because I know that Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe wants to run out the door, just for your information, version 2 of the draft report for the international student study should be distributed on Friday, February 20th. Okay. In order to have time to review it, we're scheduling the first meeting to review it on Wednesday, February 25th. And then we plan on inviting witnesses for the immigration study between now and then. So just to make sure that that is what the current proposal is. Vous avez des questions, Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe? Okay. With that,
questions, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe?
This meeting's adjourned.